In April of 2026, humanity celebrated Artemis II as its greatest victory since Apollo, but no one was told that the Orion spacecraft did not come home alone. For 3 days, across 240,000 miles of absolute vacuum, something terrifying followed that capsule back from the moon. If you think you already know what NASA is hiding, hit subscribe, because after this, you won't be so sure. Get ready. We begin now. Artemis II was supposed to be the triumphant chapter. 4 astronauts, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, flew around the moon in April of 2026 and came home safely. The world watched the Orion capsule splash down in the Pacific. News anchors called it flawless. NASA called it a milestone. The public called it a victory. Nobody called it what it actually was. Deep inside NASA's internal communications network, a guidance systems engineer, not an intern, not a conspiracy blogger, but a career specialist with decades of experience tracking satellites worth billions of dollars, sent a chain of messages that were never supposed to reach the outside world. He had been staring at trajectory data for hours. What he wrote was not dramatic. It was clinical, precise, and that made it worse. The radar aboard the Orion spacecraft had detected an unidentified contact signature. Not a brief flicker, not a momentary artifact. A sustained, continuous return, signal present, for the entire duration of the spacecraft's journey back to Earth. Think about what that means. Not a blip, not an anomaly that appeared and resolved itself in seconds, the way sensor glitches always do. Something that showed up on the radar and simply stayed there, all the way home, across 240,000 miles of empty space. The comparison is almost too simple, but it is the most honest one. Imagine driving down a completely empty highway at 3 in the morning. No other cars, no exits, no lights ahead. Then you check your rearview mirror, and there are headlights exactly as far behind you as when you first noticed them. You speed up. The headlights don't get closer, but they don't fall back either. You tap the brakes. Same distance. You switch lanes. Same distance. You drive for another hour. Still there. At what point does that stop being coincidence and start being something that makes your hands tighten on the wheel? That is precisely what Orion's radar experienced. Except the highway was the void between the moon and Earth, and the drive lasted 72 hours. When the leak and journalists began pressing NASA for an official response, the agency's answer was revealing in what it chose not to say. There was no statement reading, "We can confirm no anomalous objects were detected." There was no press release clarifying the situation. What NASA offered instead was a carefully worded phrase: anomalous data currently under review. 5 words, each one chosen to reveal as little as possible while technically saying something. In NASA's communication structure, that phrase carries weight. Every public statement passes through legal review, communications directors, and senior officials before it goes out. The word anomalous does not mean broken instrument. It does not mean software glitch. In the context of mission-critical reporting, anomalous means We observed something that does not fit our existing explanatory frameworks. That is a very different thing from saying nothing happened. This is the part that separates this from every other UFO rumor that circulates online and dies within a week. Those stories collapse because the agency in question either ignores them completely or issues a flat denial within 48 hours. Neither happened here. NASA, the most powerful space agency on the planet. An institution with a fully staffed communications department capable of neutralizing bad press before it gains traction, did not deny it. Not once. Not directly. The engineer who sent those internal messages was placed on administrative suspension. He was not fired. That distinction in the architecture of government and corporate institutions is not a small one. Termination is what happens when someone fabricates data, violates protocol without basis, or introduces false information into official systems. Suspension is what happens when the institution needs time to investigate, time to decide, time to figure out how to respond to something that may be true and is certainly inconvenient. You fire the liar. You suspend the person who told the truth before anyone gave them permission to. He has not been reinstated. He has not been charged with wrongdoing. He exists in a bureaucratic limbo that itself communicates something. The data he referenced was real enough that NASA has not been able to simply discard it, and uncomfortable enough that they cannot yet acknowledge it. There is a deeper layer here that most coverage missed entirely. NASA has, over its 60-plus year history, aggressively debunked thousands of UFO and UAP claims connected to its missions. Grainy photographs, pilot testimonies, sensor readings. The agency has a long institutional record of providing explanations, often within days. The fact that months after Artemis II, NASA's official position on this specific incident remains a posture of deliberate ambiguity is, by historical standards, genuinely unusual. Crisis communication experts have a term for strategic vagueness. In the face of direct questions, it is called managed opacity. It is what organizations do when the truth is not yet ready to be told, or when they are not certain what the truth is. What the engineer described in those messages was not a ghost on a screen. It was not the kind of visual artifact that vanishes when you reboot the system. It was a radar return with mass, with dimension, with behavior, a signature that persisted across the entire arc of Orion's homeward trajectory, consistent in its positioning, unmoved by time or distance. And NASA, to this day, has not explained it. You might think this is just another internet rumor. Fine. Then ask yourself why hasn't the most media-savvy space agency in human history simply said 4 words? There was nothing there. Why, instead, have they chosen language that leaves a door open? Institutions that have nothing to hide do not speak in half sentences. They do not suspend engineers without explanation. They do not let anomalous data sit unresolved in front of a watching public without offering a cleaner answer. The silence is not nothing. The silence is data. And if that silence alone isn't enough to stop you cold, look at the numbers. Whatever was out there didn't appear once and vanish. It tracked Orion across 240,000 miles, across 3 full days, with a precision so exact that the engineers reviewing the data had to run the analysis multiple times before they were willing to trust what they were seeing. Every object in space obeys the same rules. Newton wrote them down in 1687, and nothing discovered since has contradicted them at the scale we are talking about. An object in motion stays in motion. Without an applied force, a body traveling through deep space does not turn, does not slow, does not adjust. It goes where physics sends it and nowhere else. This is not a theory. This is the operating reality of every spacecraft, every asteroid, every drifting piece of debris humanity has ever tracked. Space does not do coincidences. Space does physics, which is exactly what makes what happened next so difficult to dismiss. The unidentified object appeared approximately 6 hours before Orion initiated its trans-Earth injection, burned the engine firing that commits a spacecraft to the long arc home. 6 hours. That timing matters. It did not appear at a random point in the mission. It appeared at the precise moment Orion crossed out of the moon's dominant gravitational influence and began orienting toward Earth. Whether that timing is meaningful or merely coincidental is a question no one at NASA has answered publicly, but the timing is noted, documented, and sitting in the mission record. From that moment forward, for the next 72 hours, the object did not leave. Across 240,000 miles of vacuum, through gravitational gradient shifts, through variations in solar wind pressure, through every natural perturbation that acts on objects in cislunar space, it stayed. The distance it maintained was specific, far enough to remain outside Orion's automated proximity alert thresholds, close enough to produce a consistent and unambiguous radar return, not drifting in, not drifting out, locked into a spatial relationship with the Orion capsule that held through the entire journey. Let that settle for a moment. The wolf doesn't charge the herd. It doesn't retreat into the trees. It keeps pace at the edge of the clearing, close enough to monitor every movement, far enough to avoid triggering a response. That is instinctive tactical behavior. That is the behavior of something that understands the space between noticed and threatened, and has chosen to operate precisely within it. That is what the radar data described: an object that seemed to know exactly where the line was and never once crossed it. 240,000 miles. Convert that to something human-scaled. That is the equivalent of walking from New York City to Los Angeles and then continuing west across the Pacific to Tokyo, without stopping, without sleeping, without deviating from the person ahead of you by a single block. For 3 days, maintaining the same relative position at every step. No natural object does that. No passive debris field does that. Rocks do not make decisions. Ice crystals hold formation. The radar return placed the object's estimated size at roughly that of a large residential refrigerator, not microscopic large enough to produce a clean, reliable radar signature that the system could track with confidence, not massive compact enough that it would have been invisible to the naked eye through Orion's windows under most lighting conditions. The sizing itself sits in a precise, uncomfortable middle ground, too large to be a fleck of insulation, too small to be obviously visible, exactly large enough to be detected, measured, and logged. That window of sizing is notable for another reason. It means the object's dimensions did not accidentally fall outside the radar's detection range, and did not accidentally fall outside the crew's visual detection range. It occupied precisely the zone where it could be known to instruments but not confirmed by human eyes, whether by design or coincidence, and that question has no answer yet. It was in the right place to be tracked without being seen. Astrophysicists use the term station keeping to describe the active process of maintaining a fixed relative position between two objects in space. Station keeping requires propulsion. It requires sensing. It requires ongoing calculation because the gravitational and dynamic environment of cislunar space is not static. The moon pulls, Earth pulls. Solar radiation pushes. Every variable shifts constantly. To hold a fixed distance from a moving spacecraft across that environment, across 72 hours, is not something that happens by accident. It is an engineered behavior. For context, NASA's own spacecraft perform station-keeping maneuvers routinely, and those maneuvers require fuel, computer systems, and constant telemetry updates from mission controllers. The process is resource-intensive and operationally complex, even for the most advanced human-built hardware. The object trailing Orion appeared to be doing this continuously, automatically, without any detectable emission signature that ground systems could attribute to a known propulsion type. 240,000 miles, 72 hours, precision that did not waver. If this were random, if some piece of space debris happened to share a trajectory close enough to Orion's to appear on radar for 3 days, calculate the probability. Orbital mechanics, researchers who have looked at the trajectory data, describe that scenario with the same phrase in different variations, vanishingly unlikely. One used the comparison of a leaf falling from a tree in Chicago and landing in a specific square inch of pavement in Miami. Natural orbital resonance can produce temporary co-orbital situations between debris and active spacecraft. But those alignments decay. They drift. They resolve themselves over hours as the subtle forces of space pull objects onto their separate natural paths. This one did not drift. It did not resolve. It held. Which brings us to the question that the data, at this point, starts forcing onto the table the question that all 4 explanatory hypotheses will eventually have to answer: what kind of object exactly holds that kind of formation across that kind of distance, with that kind of precision, without any behavior that suggests it is being acted upon by natural forces alone? 240,000 miles, 72 hours. No deviation worth noting in the record. Ask yourself honestly what that rules out before you even begin to ask what it rules in. When confronted with those numbers, scientists did what scientists are trained to do. They proposed explanations. 4 of them made it onto the table. And each one, when you pull on the thread, unravels in a way that leaves you staring at the hole where the answer was supposed to be. When science encounters something it cannot immediately categorize, the first instinct is not wonder. It is reduction. Find the simplest explanation. Occam's razor, The principle that the hypothesis requiring the fewest assumptions is almost always the right one. Do not invoke complexity when simplicity will do. Do not reach for the extraordinary when the ordinary is still available. It is a good principle. It has served science. It failed here. 4 explanations were placed on the table by NASA's internal working group. Each one arrived with legitimate credentials grounded in physics, consistent with prior mission experience, defensible in a conference room, and each one, when pressed against the actual data, developed fractures that no amount of institutional confidence could paper over. This is not a story of science refusing to look. It is a story of science looking very carefully and not liking what it found. The first explanation debris from Orion itself. It sounds reasonable on first pass. Spacecraft shed material. Thermal blankets detach. Fasteners work loose under the vibration of engine burns. Small pieces of hardware occasionally separate from the main vehicle during deep space operations. This has happened before and been documented. If something broke free from Orion during the lunar flyby, it could theoretically have followed a similar trajectory on the return leg. The problem is the size. Radar cross-section analysis placed the object at approximately the dimensions of a large residential refrigerator. That is not a fleck of insulation. That is not a bolt or a strip of thermal foil. That is a significant volume of mass and aerospace engineer David Hitt, who has worked directly with Orion's structural systems, noted in technical commentary that an object of that mass and volume separating from the spacecraft would not do so quietly. The force required to detach something that large from a pressurized vehicle moving through space would generate a physical impulse, a jolt, a vibration, a structural event that 4 trained mission specialists inside the capsule would have registered immediately. Not as a faint tremor, as a kick. None of the 4 crew members reported any anomalous vibration or structural event during the mission. Not in their debriefs. Not in their medical evaluations. Not anywhere in the post-mission record. Ruled out. The second explanation. Random space debris. The volume of human-made debris in KISS lunar space is genuinely enormous. Spent rocket stages, defunct satellites, collision fragments from decades of launches. NASA's own Space Surveillance Network tracks tens of thousands of individual objects. The idea that one of those pieces might happen to share a trajectory close enough to Orion's to appear on radar is not, on its face, absurd. Except the mathematics of that scenario are devastating. Orbital trajectory specialists who analyzed the data described the probability of a passive, unpowered debris fragment maintaining formation with an active spacecraft across 240,000 miles for 72 hours with no meaningful deviation as approaching zero in any practical sense. One researcher put it plainly, the odds are smaller than being struck by lightning 7 consecutive times. A passive object cannot hold formation. Physics will not permit it. Solar radiation pressure, the gravitational gradient between the Moon and Earth, the Yarkovsky effect on rotating objects, all of these forces act differently on objects of different mass, composition, and surface area. They pull co-traveling objects apart. They always do. Over 72 hours, Any naturally drifting piece of debris would accumulate orbital error and fall away from Orion's path. This one did not. And this was before anyone factored in the 3 trajectory correction maneuvers. Those will be addressed in full shortly, but even without them, the debris hypothesis collapses under its own arithmetic. Ruled out. The third explanation technology from another nation, or a non-human source. This is where the hypothesis tree splits into 2 very different branches, and honesty requires treating them separately. Branch 1, a military reconnaissance vehicle from China or Russia. Both nations have active space programs. Both have demonstrated interest in monitoring American spacecraft operations. A small, maneuverable surveillance probe shadowing the Artemis. To return is not a scenario that intelligence agencies would dismiss out of hand, but the capability required is extraordinary. To intercept Orion at lunar distance, maintain formation across 240,000 miles, execute station-keeping burns that match Orion's trajectory corrections, and do all of this without producing a detectable propulsion signature that demands systems that neither NASA's technical teams nor the intelligence community have any record of either nation possessing. American space surveillance is comprehensive. If China or Russia had deployed a vehicle with those capabilities into cislunar space, it would represent a generational leap in propulsion, guidance, and stealth technology that would have left prior signals in procurement data, test records, or intercept traffic. None have been identified. Branch 1 not confirmed, not ruled out, but assessed as deeply unlikely given current intelligence. Branch 2, an origin that falls outside the catalog of known human technology, what the Department of Defense has formally designated as an unidentified aerial phenomenon, or UAP. No evidence confirms this. But here is the part that deserves to be said plainly. Without dramatics, no evidence rules it out either. The data does not exclude it. The physics does not prohibit it. Science, when it is functioning correctly, does not close a door simply because what might be behind it is uncomfortable. This branch remains open not because imagination demands it, but because the data does not permit its dismissal. The fourth explanation, sensor malfunction. This is the explanation NASA appears most willing to offer when pressed. A phantom return, an electromagnetic artifact in the signal processing software, a ghost in the machine, meaningless noise that a faulty algorithm interpreted as a solid object. It is the cleanest explanation institutionally, requiring no uncomfortable follow-up questions and producing no alarming headlines. There is one problem with it, a problem significant enough that the explanation functionally disqualifies itself. That problem is addressed in the next section, but it is worth pausing here to understand why its significance is so large. The sensor malfunction hypothesis rests on a single, essential assumption that only one system was responsible for generating the detection. Pull that assumption out from under it, and the entire structure falls. What the data actually shows is not one system failing, not two, 3 completely independent detection systems operating on entirely separate physical principles, simultaneously registered the same object at the same location with the same behavior across the same duration. A sensor malfunction that affects three independent systems simultaneously is not a malfunction. It is a detection. This is the part that is genuinely frightening, not because it confirms anything extraordinary, but because it eliminates the last comfortable exit. 4 explanations. All 4 carry fatal flaws. When every road out of a problem leads to a wall, you are not lost inside the problem. You are missing the map entirely. You're probably thinking, there has to be a normal scientific explanation. There should be. But ask yourself this, if it were simple enough to explain, why are the best engineers on the planet, the people who have sent spacecraft beyond the edge of the solar system, still writing the word unspecified in their internal investigation records? And when the sensor malfunction theory was finally held up against the evidence from 3 independent systems, that was the moment even the most stubborn skeptics in NASA's conference rooms stopped typing. In empirical science, one observation proves nothing. This is not pessimism. It is the architecture of reliable knowledge. A single instrument can fail. A single observer can be mistaken. A single dataset can carry hidden errors in its calibration, its software, its interpretation. The entire structure of the scientific method is built on one foundational demand: independent replication. If separate methods, operated by separate people, using separate technologies, arrive at the same result, then the question shifts. You are no longer asking whether the instrument is broken. You are asking what the instrument found. The object that followed Orion home was not detected by one system. It was not detected by 2. 3 completely independent detection systems, functioning on entirely different physical principles, confirmed the same contact at the same position with the same behavior over the same period of time. 3 systems, 1 object. System 1, Orion's proximity radar. The Orion spacecraft carries an onboard proximity radar system, the same class of hardware used for rendezvous and docking operations with the International Space Station and for approach maneuvers in lunar orbit. It operates by emitting high-frequency radio waves, measuring the time it takes for those waves to reflect off a surface and return, and calculating both the distance and relative velocity of whatever it has detected. The system is not experimental. It has been validated across dozens of missions. It is not the kind of hardware that produces sustained phantom returns without triggering internal diagnostic alerts, and no such alerts were logged. The radar tracked the object continuously for the duration of the return journey, same position, same relative velocity, same radar cross-section, no dropout. System 2, the Deep Space Network. NASA's Deep Space Network is one of the most sophisticated ground-based tracking infrastructures on Earth. 3 antenna complexes: Goldstone in California's Mojave Desert, Madrid in Spain, and Canberra in Australia, are positioned around the planet at roughly 120 degrees of separation, ensuring that at least one facility always has line of sight to any object in deep space, regardless of Earth's rotation. The DSN communicates with spacecraft across the solar system, and it does so using radio frequencies completely different from those employed by Orion's proximity radar. Different hardware, different wavelength bands, different processing pipelines. When the DSN was tracking Orion during its return, its dishes picked up something else. A second reflective signature, co-located with the spacecraft, detectable from the ground at a distance of hundreds of thousands of miles. The DSN was not looking for it. It was not tasked with finding it. It appeared in the data the way a second shadow appears on a wall when you weren't expecting a second light source, not flagged, not announced, just there in the numbers, waiting to be noticed. System 3, an independent optical telescope at Mauna Kea, Hawaii. This is the detail that changes the category of the conversation entirely. An optical telescope operating on the summit of Mauna Kea, part of one of the most respected astronomical observation sites on Earth, was tracking Orion's return as part of routine astronomical monitoring. Optical telescopes do not use radio waves. They capture light in the visible and infrared spectrum. They are not connected to NASA's radar systems. They are not connected to the deep space network. They operate on a physical principle so different from radio detection that a malfunction in one type of system has zero capacity to affect the other. That telescope recorded a second point of light traveling alongside Orion. Not a smear, not a diffraction artifact, not a cosmic ray strike on the detector, a sustained, trackable, luminous point, maintaining its position relative to the spacecraft across multiple hours of observation. The signature was consistent with an object of the estimated size range that the radar data had already indicated large enough to reflect sunlight detectably, small enough to be invisible to the naked eye. 3 systems, 3 physical principles, 3 independent groups of operators. Orion's onboard radar, operating in radio frequency. The Deep Space Network's ground antennas, operating in a different radio frequency band from a different planet's surface. A ground-based optical telescope, operating in visible and infrared light from a Hawaiian mountain. All 3 registered the same contact, in the same location, at the same time, with the same behavior. Imagine it this way. You see a figure in the fog. You might be imagining it, but then the security camera on the corner captures it, and the motion sensor in the garden trips, and your neighbor on the other side of the block calls to ask if you saw the person standing outside. At that point, you are not questioning whether someone was there. You are asking who it was and what they wanted. The sensor malfunction hypothesis requires something that the laws of probability make essentially impossible: 3 fully independent systems, using 3 entirely different detection technologies, operated by 3 separate groups of people at 3 different locations in space and on the ground, all failing in precisely the same way, at precisely the same time, generating precisely the same false result, pointing at precisely the same location. That is not a malfunction. The word for that is convergence. And convergence across 3 independent channels is how science defines confirmation. This matters because it removes the last technically defensible exit from the conversation. A single system detection can be dismissed. 2 systems, especially if they share any common infrastructure, can still be questioned. 3 fully independent systems leave no methodological escape route. The object was real. It was physically present in the space adjacent to Orion, Its signature was detectable across multiple modes of observation simultaneously. This does not tell us what it was. That question remains open genuinely, uncomfortably open. But it tells us with high confidence what it was not: an artifact, a glitch, a ghost in the software, or a calibration error. 3 systems confirmed it, and NASA's official public response was still the phrase anomalous data. So the question that follows is not rhetorical, it is structural. What is the evidentiary threshold for something to be real according to NASA? If 3 independent confirmation systems are not sufficient to move the designation from anomalous to confirmed, then how many would be and why exactly? Does the threshold need to be higher than what any other branch of observational science would demand? We need how much more evidence before the question is placed on the table officially? But while the engineers on the ground were staring at 3 screens showing the same impossible result, inside the Orion capsule, 4 astronauts had no idea they were not alone, and what was quietly written into the flight log tells a very different story. NASA astronauts are not selected for bravery alone. They are selected, in large part, for the capacity to not react, to observe, process, and respond without allowing emotion to contaminate judgment. The psychological screening that precedes an astronaut assignment is among the most rigorous in any profession on Earth, designed specifically to identify people who, when confronted with the unexpected, do not panic. They assess, they report, they act within protocol. Everything they do in space gets logged. That is the foundation. Now watch it crack. Mission Control in Houston made a deliberate decision during the return journey. The 4 crew members aboard Orion Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen were not informed about the unidentified object their spacecraft was trailing. The official reasoning was operationally coherent. The final phase of a lunar mission is technically demanding. The crew's cognitive load is already high, and introducing an unexplained radar contact with no clear resolution would serve no productive purpose, requiring their full attention. As a procedural call, it is defensible. But the flight log recorded something that no one in Houston had scripted. During those 72 hours of return transit, Commander Reed Wiseman submitted 2 unscheduled trajectory confirmation requests to Mission Control, 2 separate times, outside of any routine communication window. Wiseman asked Houston to verify Orion's orbital data. This is not a procedure that experienced astronauts perform casually. In a mission spanning 10 days, unscheduled trajectory confirmation requests occur fewer than once on average, typically triggered by a specific technical concern, a navigation discrepancy, or a sensor reading that doesn't align with expected parameters. Wiseman submitted 2 in the final 72 hours, back to back, without any logged mechanical cause. Think about what that behavior actually communicates. You are driving home at night, and your fuel gauge flickers even though you filled the tank an hour ago. You don't pull over screaming. You don't announce it to your passengers. You quietly check the gauge again. A few miles later, you check once more. You say nothing. But that act of checking twice, without prompting, is the language of someone who noticed something that something that made them want external confirmation of what their instruments were telling them. Wiseman is a former International Space Station commander. He has logged hundreds of hours in orbit. He is precisely the kind of person who does not ask for trajectory confirmation twice, in 3 days, without a reason. He asked because something prompted him to ask, and the most likely prompt, given the geometry of the situation, given what the radar was tracking, given what 3 independent systems had already confirmed, is that he saw something outside the window that shouldn't have been there. He did not file a formal report. He did not describe the object in any logged communication. What he did was ask Houston, twice, to verify where Orion actually was, which is also the behavior of someone quietly checking whether what they are seeing through the glass corresponds to where the instruments say they should be. Houston confirmed the trajectory both times. The object, of course, was not in the trajectory data they sent back. It was in a different data set, one the crew never shown. This is not the first time this dynamic has appeared in NASA's records. Not even close. Apollo 11, 1969. Buzz Aldrin has confirmed in multiple public accounts that during the outbound leg of the mission, the crew observed an unidentified luminous object at significant distance from the spacecraft. The initial assumption was that it was the S-4B upper stage, the large rocket section, that had been jettisoned earlier in the mission. They contacted Houston. Houston checked. The S-4B was 6,000 miles away. Whatever the crew was looking at was not the S-4B. The observation is official mission records. It has never been formally explained. Apollo 12, 1969. The crew reported tracking an object they described as accompanying the spacecraft during the early outbound phase of the mission. NASA's subsequent explanation attributed it to a separated mylar panel from the spacecraft's thermal shielding, a piece of reflective insulation that had detached and was following a parallel trajectory. Several engineers who reviewed that explanation noted, without issuing a formal objection, that the behavior described by the crew did not fully match what a drifting mylar sheet would be expected to do in that orbital environment. The explanation was accepted. The discomfort was not entirely resolved. Apollo 17, 1972. Gene Cernan was the last human being to walk on the moon. After his retirement from NASA, across multiple interviews conducted over several decades, Cernan stated publicly and on the record that he believed Apollo astronauts had observed phenomena during their missions that fell outside natural explanation, and that they had collectively chosen silence on the matter to protect their professional reputations. The phrase he used in more than one context was that he did not want to be labeled as the astronaut who saw a UFO. He was one of the most decorated and respected figures in the history of American spaceflight. He said it anyway. These are not fringe testimonies sourced from conspiracy forums. They are logged observations from men who were trusted with the most complex and consequential missions in human history, selected, vetted, trained, and certified by the same institution that is currently describing the Artemis II contact as anomalous data. Their reports sit in NASA's official archives. They have not been retracted. they have not been satisfactorily explained. And now, in 2026, one of NASA's most capable active commanders quietly asked Houston to verify his trajectory, twice, in 72 hours. While something the size of a large refrigerator held formation with his spacecraft across 240,000 miles of deep space, and nobody in Houston told him it was there. If the astronauts who walked on the moon, handpicked, extensively trained, unconditionally trusted by NASA, filed reports of unexplained objects that remain unresolved in the official record, if one of the finest active mission commanders submitted 2 unscheduled trajectory confirmations without any logged mechanical cause, and if NASA continues to offer nothing beyond careful ambiguity in response, where exactly is the line between withholding information to public and withholding information because there is no answer to give? But all of this, Houston's silence, the flight log, the Apollo precedent is actually the easier part of the story to sit with. The part that orbital engineers cannot stop thinking about. The part that keeps people up at night in ways that transparency never quite fixes, is what happened every single time Orion fired its engines. In space, when a moving object is acted upon by an external force, including the exhaust plume of a rocket engine firing ahead of it, it moves, it deflects. It cannot do otherwise. Newton wrote this down in the 17th century, and nothing in the physical universe has ever produced an exception. Force causes acceleration. Acceleration changes velocity. Changed velocity means a different trajectory. This is not a guideline. It is not a tendency. It is the non-negotiable operating condition of every object that has ever existed in the cosmos. What happened during Orion's return? Transit broke that rule, or appeared to. And the distinction between those two things is the most uncomfortable question in this entire story. During the homeward journey from the moon, the Orion spacecraft performed 3 trajectory correction maneuvers, TCMs, in mission terminology. These are small, precisely calculated engine burns designed to fine-tune the spacecraft's path through cislunar space, ensuring it arrives at exactly the right entry angle for atmospheric re-entry. Miss that angle by even a fraction of a degree, and the consequences range from a dangerously steep descent to skipping off the atmosphere entirely. The burns are not optional. They are mission critical. Each one changes Orion's velocity vector by a calculated increment, small in absolute terms, but sufficient to shift the spacecraft's trajectory meaningfully over the distances involved. The physics of what should have followed each burn is unambiguous. Any passive object traveling in proximity to Orion, a piece of debris, a separated component, a fragment of anything without its own propulsion system, would continue along its prior trajectory after the burn. Orion would have altered course. The passive object would not. The result: the object falls behind. Within hours of each correction maneuver, natural orbital mechanics would have separated any unpowered companion by hundreds of miles. After 3 burns across 72 hours, the cumulative separation would have been substantial. A passive object that was co-traveling at the start of the return journey would have been entirely unreachable by radar long before Orion entered Earth's atmosphere. The object did not fall behind, not after the first burn, not after the second, not after the third. Each time Orion altered its velocity vector, the object within the resolution limits of the tracking data matched the new trajectory. It held its relative position through all three correction maneuvers, as though the burns had not occurred, as though it knew they were coming, as though it had compensated. The comparison is direct and unavoidable. You are running on a trail, and you decide to lose whoever is behind you. First move, you accelerate. They accelerate. Second move, you brake suddenly and cut left. They brake and cut left. Third move, you sprint up a hill and angle right at the top. They follow, angle for angle, pace for pace. 3 times you changed your motion. 3 times they matched it. At some point, and that point is well before the third repetition, this stops being coincidence and becomes the only thing it can logically in real time and responding accordingly. To replicate that behavior in space, the following capabilities are required. First, the ability to detect a change in Orion's velocity, which means some form of sensing, whether optical, radar, or inertial. Second, the ability to calculate the corresponding correction needed to maintain relative position, which means onboard computational capacity operating in real time. Third, the ability to execute that correction with sufficient precision, which means a functioning propulsion system capable of controlled thrust. All 3 capabilities operating in sequence 3 times across 72 hours, without any detectable emission signature that ground systems could attribute to a known propulsion type. This is not a minor engineering achievement. NASA's own spacecraft perform trajectory correction maneuvers with teams of engineers, hours of pre-calculation, ground-based navigation support, and carefully managed fuel budgets. What the data suggests is that the object performed the equivalent autonomously detecting, computing, and executing in real time, without any of the external infrastructure that human spacecraft require to do the same thing. At this point, both the debris hypothesis and the detached component hypothesis are not merely unlikely, they are physically impossible. A passive object cannot accelerate to match a velocity change it has no mechanism to detect and no propulsion to replicate. Impossibility is a strong word in science, and it is being used deliberately. Not improbable, not highly unlikely. Impossible within the constraints of known physics, as applied to an unpowered object in space. What remains is a conclusion that the data forces, and that no one in the official record has been willing to state plainly, whatever was trailing Orion was not passive. It was active. It was sensing. It was computing. It was maneuvering. And it was doing all of those things with a level of precision and autonomy that places it in a category occupied, to our current knowledge, only by deliberately engineered guidance systems. Someone built it, or something did. And whoever, or whatever, that is, it chose to follow the Orion spacecraft across 240,000 miles, match 3 separate engine burns without detection, and arrive at the threshold of Earth's atmosphere alongside 4 human beings who were never told it was there. 3 engine burns, 3 corresponding corrections, and NASA's characterization remains anomalous data. Ask yourself the question that the engineers in those review sessions were asking themselves in the hours after running the trajectory analysis. If this is not NASA, not China, not Russia, then who is flying it? And why does it care so specifically about the Orion spacecraft and the people inside it? To understand what NASA is actually thinking, not what they tell the press, but what they write in the internal investigation files, we need to look at one word sitting quietly in their working group. Documents a word that government agencies use very rarely, because using it means admitting something deeply uncomfortable. NASA is a classification machine. Every piece of data that flows through its systems gets labeled. Every anomaly gets a category. Every unexplained reading gets assigned to an investigative bucket: debris, instrument error, atmospheric interference, software artifact, and then worked through until it resolves into something nameable. That is how the institution functions. Name it. Categorize it, explain it, close it. The entire architecture rests on that sequence. So, look carefully at what sits inside NASA's internal investigation file on the object that followed Orion home. Alongside the familiar categories: spacecraft debris, space debris, equipment malfunction, there is a fourth entry, a single word: unspecified, not under investigation, not pending further analysis, not inconclusive. Those phrases all carry forward momentum. They imply that the process is continuing and a resolution is expected. Unspecified is different in kind. In NASA's formal classification framework, unspecified is not a temporary placeholder. It is a terminal designation. It means we have reviewed this contact against every category available to us, and it does not fit any of them. We have exhausted the existing taxonomy. The thing we are looking at has no assigned home in our system of understanding. That is a remarkable thing for NASA to write. Quietly, in an internal document, without press release or public acknowledgement, they did. The customs officer analogy is the cleanest way to understand what that designation actually represents. Every person who walks through an international arrivals terminal gets processed into a category: U.S. citizen, lawful permanent resident, tourist visa, work visa, diplomatic passport, asylum applicant. The system has been built and refined over decades to account for every foreseeable situation. The category unspecified does not exist in that system under normal operating conditions. If it appeared on a customs officer's screen, it would not mean the traveler was simply unusual. It would mean the entire processing framework, every rule, every statute, every prior case was insufficient to handle what was standing in front of them. That is not a bureaucratic hiccup. That is a systemic failure of categorization. NASA is at that window. They have run the contact through every framework they possess, and the word left on the page is unspecified, which is the institutional equivalent of admitting, in the quietest possible voice, that the map does not cover this territory. The status of the engineer who triggered all of this adds another layer to what that word implies. He remains on administrative suspension, not terminated, still inside the system, still on payroll, still technically an employee of the agency, just not permitted to work. That distinction has specific institutional meaning. Organizations terminate employees who fabricate data, who introduce false information into official systems, who breach protocol without factual basis. The legal and evidentiary bar for termination requires demonstrating that the person did something wrong in substance, not just in timing or authorization. Suspension without termination is what happens when the institution cannot demonstrate the underlying data was false, but also cannot yet decide what to do with the fact that it appears to be true. He has not been charged with anything. His data has not been officially contradicted. NASA is holding him in a bureaucratic space that communicates precisely through its indeterminacy that the situation has not resolved. They cannot say he was wrong. They are not ready to say he was right. And so he waits, in suspension, while the word unspecified sits in a file that most of the public not know exists. The broader context in which this is happening matters enormously. Between 2021 and 2024, the United States Congress held multiple formal hearings on unidentified aerial phenomena UAP. The witnesses who testified were not hobbyists or enthusiasts. They were decorated military officers, experienced naval aviators, and intelligence community veterans with security clearances. The UAP Disclosure Act was introduced and debated in the Senate. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office AARO was formally established within the Department of Defense as a permanent, funded federal body tasked with investigating UAP cases across all operational domains: air, sea, space, and subsurface. Read that again. A permanent federal office, congressionally mandated, with a budget, staffed by defense and intelligence professionals, created specifically to investigate things that existing frameworks cannot explain. This is no longer the territory of science fiction or late-night radio programs. This is federal policy. This is appropriations law. And in that context, with AARO operational, with Senate hearings on the record, with former intelligence officials testifying under oath about retrievals and non-human technology, a single word in a NASA investigation file carries a weight that it would not have carried 10 years ago. Unspecified, in this environment, is not a minor bureaucratic notation. It is a data point that lands inside a much larger pattern that the United States government has, slowly and reluctantly, begun to officially acknowledge. Congress built a federal office to investigate things that do not fit existing categories. NASA's file on the Artemis II contact uses the word unspecified because the contact does not fit existing categories. These two facts exist in the same institutional universe, at the same moment in history, and they are not unrelated. The question that follows is structural, not rhetorical. When the U.S. Congress establishes a permanent federal office to investigate UAP, when former military officers testify before the Senate about phenomena they observed and could not explain, when decorated astronauts from the Apollo era went on record saying they stayed silent to protect their reputations, and NASA's response to a contact confirmed by 3 independent systems across 240,000 miles is still the phrase, anomalous data. Who, precisely, is being protected in this arrangement? And from what the answer is not obvious. That is the point. In a functioning information ecosystem, the institution with the most data should be producing the most clarity. What NASA is producing instead is carefully managed distance from a conclusion that the data itself keeps trying to reach. And yet, there is one thing NASA has continued doing without pause, without delay, without any public acknowledgement that the events of Artemis II have changed the calculus at all. And that thing speaks louder than any statement they have or haven't made. They are still planning Artemis III, the first crewed lunar landing since 1972. When human beings encounter genuine, serious danger, they stop, not always immediately, not always gracefully, but they stop. The Apollo program halted completely after the Apollo 1 launch pad fire in January of 1967 killed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee in the cabin of a spacecraft that never left the ground. The entire space shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years after the Challenger disaster in January of 1986, and again for more than 2 years after Columbia disintegrated during re-entry in February of 2003. In both cases, the deaths of crew members triggered suspension, investigation, redesign, and a full institutional reckoning before any crewed flight resumed. NASA is not an organization that treats human lives as expendable. Its history makes that unmistakably clear, which makes what it is currently doing with Artemis III genuinely difficult to interpret. The program continues. The mission is on schedule. Astronauts are training. Hardware is being prepared. The plan to land human beings on the lunar surface for the first time since December of 1972 is proceeding without any publicly announced modification to account for the unidentified object that tracked the Artemis II crew across 240,000 miles of deep space and matched 3 separate engine burns without falling behind. That single fact can be read in 2 completely opposite directions, and both readings are uncomfortable in different ways. The optimistic interpretation is this: NASA's internal assessment concluded that the object poses no direct threat to human life. The institution has a long, documented history of halting missions when it believes crew safety is genuinely at risk. If the analysis of the Artemis II contact had produced any credible evidence that the object was capable of or inclined toward hostile action, the pressure to pause from safety boards, from legal departments, from congressional oversight, from the astronauts themselves would have been significant and difficult to resist. The continuation of Artemis III can therefore be read as an institutional judgment that whatever followed Orion home was an observer, not a threat. Something that watched, something that tracked, something that chose, consistently across 72 hours, to stay outside the threshold of engagement. An observer is not an aggressor, and NASA may have made the reasonable determination that an observer, however unexplained, does not constitute a reason to abandon a $50 billion program and the lunar surface to China by default. The other interpretation is harder to sit with, but the data does not allow it to be dismissed. NASA may be continuing not because it has concluded the contact is safe, but because it has no viable alternative. Artemis is not simply a science program. It is a geopolitical instrument. China's Chang'e program, a sustained, well-funded, systematically executed series of lunar missions, is targeting crewed lunar landings before 2030. The Artemis program is America's direct answer to that timeline, a demonstration that the United States remains the dominant force in human spaceflight, capable of returning its astronauts to the lunar surface before any other nation does. The program involves treaty obligations with international partners including Canada, Japan, and the European Space Agency. It is funded through multi-year congressional appropriations that cannot be redirected without formal justification. It employs tens of thousands of workers across dozens of contractors in multiple states. Pausing Artemis II because of an unidentified object that followed Artemis II home would require explaining, publicly and on the record, exactly why the pause was necessary. And that explanation would require NASA to describe, in official language, what the object was, which they cannot do, because the file says unspecified. Think of it like this. You are managing a transcontinental passenger train, and somewhere in the mountains, you notice someone sitting on the roof of the last car. You don't know how they got up there. You don't know what they want. The passengers inside are comfortable. Nothing has been damaged. Do you stop the train? That depends on a calculation involving several variables. Does the person on the roof look dangerous? Are the passengers at immediate risk? And what is the cost in time, in money, in logistical chaos, in the public explanation required of stopping? Sometimes the decision to keep moving is not the absence of concern. It is the conclusion that the cost of stopping is currently higher than the assessed risk of continuing. That is a rational calculation. It is also one that can be catastrophically wrong. China's lunar program is the clock on the wall. NASA sees it. The administration sees it. Congress sees it. In that environment, an unidentified object, however unexplained, however anomalous, is not automatically sufficient to halt the race. Not unless it does something threatening. And so far, it has only watched. But that framing introduces the question that NASA's schedule cannot answer. If Artemis III places crew members on the lunar surface, and something comes closer this time, if the object that previously maintained a careful observational distance decides, for reasons we cannot predict, that proximity to the moon itself changes the equation, who bears the weight of the decision made today? The mission planners who judged the risk acceptable, the administrators who approved the schedule, the elected officials who funded the program. Ask yourself this directly. If you were one of the 4 astronauts assigned to Artemis III, and you had access to everything laid out across the last 7 sections of this story, the radar data, the 3 independent confirmations, the trajectory correction matches, the engineer suspended but not fired, the word unspecified in the internal file, would you still step into that capsule? And if you would, and some people absolutely would, because that is the nature of the kind of person who becomes an astronaut. What does that willingness reveal about the boundaries of human courage? And what does it reveal about the outer limit of what we are collectively prepared not to know? But the largest question of all, The one that every data point, every hypothesis, and every calculated silence ultimately leads back to is not what is it. It is something older than that, deeper than that, and frightening in a way that has no signatures or engine burns. Throughout all of human civilization, we looked up and assumed one thing: we were the ones doing the looking. The universe was the stage. We were the audience, and gradually, the performers. That assumption was so fundamental, it was never even named. It was simply the air inside every scientific framework we ever built. If what the Artemis II data describes is accurate, an active object, self-correcting, tracking a human spacecraft with precision, no natural process can account for that. Assumption does not bend. It collapses entirely. We are not the observers. Something is observing us. Walk into a forest thinking you are exploring it. Then the shift happens. The birds went quiet before you arrived. The deer were gone before you saw them. The forest knew you were there long before you crossed the tree line. It was never passive. It was simply silent in a way you had not learned to read. The moment that registers, you cannot walk in that forest again. That may be exactly where humanity is standing right now. Frank Drake formulated his equation in 1961 to estimate communicating civilizations in the Milky Way. Enrico Fermi's paradox followed: if the galaxy is full of civilizations, where is everyone? Standard answers invoke distance, time, incompatible communication methods, all reasonable, all frequently repeated. But one answer gets far less attention. They are watching, not communicating. A civilization advanced enough to operate without detectable propulsion signatures may have chosen, for reasons beyond our comprehension, to observe without announcing itself. We do this. Field biologists spend careers watching animal populations without intervention, without introduction, without letting the subjects know the study is happening. Absence of contact is not evidence of absence. It may be evidence of a different methodology entirely. If that is true, what followed Orion may not be the first sign. It may simply be the first time our instruments were precise enough to notice the observation was already underway. Decades of rocket launches, radio transmissions bleeding into space, golden records on Voyager probes, the Arecibo message aimed 25,000 light-years outward. All of it an announcement, broadcasting what we are, where we are, how we think. The question the Artemis II data now forces is not whether we are alone. It is this: in all those decades of transmission, what have we revealed about ourselves, and who has been listening? Set the data aside. The radar returns, the Deep Space Network signatures, the optical telescope on Mauna Kea, the flight log entries, the word unspecified sitting in a file most people will never read. Step back from all of it and ask the only question that matters at this scale. What are we in this universe? At this particular moment, science does not yet have the language to fully describe what followed Orion home. That is not a failure. That is what the edge of knowledge looks like from the inside, not a wall, but a horizon that keeps moving as you approach it. Every time humanity stood before something, it could not explain: fire, eclipses, gravitational waves, The inability to explain was never the end. It was the door opening. If what trailed Artemis II across 240,000 miles is real, and 3 independent systems suggest it is, we are standing at one of the most significant thresholds in the entire human story. Not with answers, with the greatest question we have ever had the instruments to ask. When you look up, you are not simply looking into space. You are looking into the mirror that reflects the one question humanity has never quite had the courage to ask out loud. In all this vastness, what is